On Wednesday afternoon, Donald Trump posted something on social media that had almost nothing to do with Canada directly, and almost everything to do with the actual story unfolding underneath this entire trade war. I don't think the GOP fully grasps how badly they are messing up right now. He wrote, reposting a warning from a right-wing commentator that the party was sleepwalking toward a midterm reckoning it doesn't see coming. That is not the language of a president confidently escalating a trade war from a position of political strength. That is the language of a president watching pressure build from multiple directions at once. A round of tariffs that just triggered Canadian retaliation, an approval rating sitting at some of the lowest levels of his entire second term, his own party publicly criticizing his latest trade decisions, and legal experts calling the odds of a court challenge to these specific tariffs high. Most coverage of this story has spent the last week asking whether Canada blinks first. That may be the wrong question. A meaningful amount of the real pressure in this standoff appears to be building in Washington, not Ottawa, and it has been building for months, well before this particular weekend's tariff collapse. It's worth pausing on how unusual it is for a sitting president to post this kind of unfiltered internal criticism of his own party in public view at all. Presidents typically reserve their harshest assessments of their own party's midterm prospects for closed-door meetings, specifically because public admissions of internal disarray tend to compound the very problem they're describing, discouraging donors, unsettling candidates already worried about their own races, and handing opposition researchers a direct quote for campaign advertising. The fact that Trump aired this frustration publicly on his own platform, rather than through any more controlled internal channel, suggests either a genuine loss of the message discipline his political operation typically maintains, or a calculated bet that public pressure on his own party might motivate urgency. He believes vulnerable Republicans currently lack. Either explanation points toward the same underlying reality, an administration that recognizes at the highest level that the trajectory heading into November looks considerably worse than the confident predictions Trump was making to House Republicans just months earlier. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell a story more damaging to Trump's political position right now than any single headline about Canadian retaliation could. According to Nate Silver's Silver Bulletin polling average, Trump's approval sat at 38.2% as of late July, with disapproval at 58.8%, a net approval of negative 20.6 points, a record low for his second term at that point. As of late August, that average approval figure has held right around 38%. A Quinnipiac University poll released in late July found 58% of voters disapproving of his job performance against 32% approving Trump's lowest approval, recorded by that pollster across both of his terms. An AP NORC poll around the same time put his approval at 33%, also a record low in their tracking since his return to the White House. Reuters and Ipsos polling has similarly shown his approval holding around 33%, with his disapproval climbing to 65% by late August. Nate Silver himself has been direct about why. Writing on X, Silver noted the timing of Trump's approval decline lines up remarkably closely with rising gas prices and the resumption of hostilities in the Iran conflict. That conflict, nearing its 6-month mark by late August, has driven gas prices up substantially from around $3.15 a gallon a year earlier to roughly $4.11 by late July and into August, a direct consequence of disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz, a corridor through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes. Reuters and Ipsos polling found that 80% of Americans believe U.S. involvement in that conflict will continue for an extended period, a genuinely pessimistic outlook that compounds with tariff-driven economic anxiety to create a broader mood of instability many voters appear to be attributing to the administration's overall approach to governing, rather than to any single policy in isolation. Trump's approval specifically on the economy tells an even more concentrated story of vulnerability. Nate Silver's tracking has shown his net approval on the economy running negative by double digits for months, and negative on trade and inflation as well, with only immigration remaining a consistently net positive issue for him throughout this term. Gap between strength on his core base's priority issues and cratering broader approval on the issues moderate and swing voters consistently say matter most. The economy, trade, and the cost of living is precisely the combination that tends to produce a genuine midterm wave against a president's own party. Because it suggests his coalition hasn't grown or softened opposition, it has simply calcified around a shrinking floor while the rest of the electorate moves further away. Analysis from the Brookings Institution earlier this year noted that, for the first time since 2010, Democrats are now more trusted than Republicans to handle the economy, and that Republican-held seats in states like North Carolina, Maine, Alaska, and Ohio have become genuinely competitive, with previously safe territory no longer regarded as such. Forbes, reporting from late August, specifically flagged multiple Senate races where Trump's low approval rating threatens to drag down Republican candidates, even as Cook Political Report still rates the overall battle for Senate control as a toss-up leaning slightly Republican. These are not marginal, symbolic contests. They're exactly the kinds of races that determine whether a party retains control of Congress, and Republican strategists are watching them closely. This is the backdrop against which Trump's Wednesday afternoon social media post needs to be understood, because it didn't come from nowhere. It came days after 50% tariffs on Canadian goods took effect following a collapsed negotiation, and immediately after members of his own party began publicly criticizing his handling of that specific trade decision. Republicans criticizing a sitting president's tariff moves openly, on the record, at a moment when his approval rating sits at levels comparable to where Joe Biden stood at the same point in his own presidency, is a comparison Trump's own team would likely find genuinely uncomfortable, given how central attacking Biden's economic record was to Trump's own campaign and presidency. It's worth understanding why elected Republicans specifically, rather than just media commentators, have started criticizing these tariff decisions publicly. Because members of Congress rarely break from a sitting president of their own party unless the underlying political data has become difficult to ignore internally. Public polling tends to lag what campaign operatives and elected officials are already seeing in their own internal surveys and constituent contact logs, which means the criticism emerging this week likely reflects concerns that have been building privately inside Republican political operations for longer than headlines suggest. A member of Congress doesn't risk publicly criticizing a president who remains popular with their own primary voters, without a genuinely compelling reason, since doing so invites real risk of a primary challenge from a more loyal candidate. The fact that multiple Republicans have taken that risk specifically over tariff decisions suggests the internal data available to them looks even more alarming than the public polling already indicates. Now layer a separate track of vulnerability on top of this political pressure, because it has nothing to do with approval ratings and everything to do with whether these specific Canadian tariffs can survive contact with the American court system. George Mason University law professor Ilya Somin, who was directly involved in the earlier legal case that resulted in the Supreme Court striking down Trump's previous tariff authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, said this year that the chances of the latest Canadian tariffs facing a court challenge are, in his assessment, quite high, pointing specifically to the range of industry groups and American states positioned to suffer real documented damage from this escalating trade war. Exactly the kind of concrete, demonstrable harm that gives plaintiffs standing to bring a case in the first place. That comparison matters because it isn't a general observation about how litigious American trade policy tends to be. It's an informed prediction from someone who has already prevailed against this administration in court once, on closely related legal terrain. The core argument against Section 338, the specific statute underpinning these Canadian tariffs, that it predates the World Trade Organization and modern trade law almost entirely, and that it may have been effectively superseded by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974, mirrors the same kind of statutory Consider what that legal vulnerability means for the broader political pressure Trump faces right now, because the two tracks, polling and litigation, reinforce each other in a way that makes this moment more dangerous than either issue would be in isolation. A president with strong approval ratings can often absorb an adverse court ruling as a technical legal setback, rather than a broader referendum on competence. A president already sitting at some of the lowest approval numbers of his entire second term, It's worth examining which parts of the Republican coalition are breaking from Trump specifically on this issue, because the pattern reveals where the political damage is concentrated most acutely: industries and states with heavy exposure to Canadian trade. Canada remains the single largest export market for a large number of American states, and Republican elected officials from those states face the most direct pressure to distance themselves from a trade policy generating real, visible economic pain for their constituents. A senator or a representative from a farm state watching agricultural input costs rise American approval ratings and the American legal system have consistently functioned as the primary channels through which real pressure builds against an aggressive tariff strategy, arguably more than whatever retaliatory measures a trading partner announces in response. There's a documented pattern here that's worth understanding on its own terms, because it isn't a one-off observation specific to this particular week. Trump has, at multiple points throughout this term, projected maximum public aggression on tariffs, while quietly retreating once the domestic political cost, whether measured in stock market losses, consumer price complaints, or organized industry lobbying, became too visible to ignore. Just weeks before this Canadian escalation, facing growing public frustration over grocery prices, Trump rolled back tariffs on more than 200 food products, specifically because of mounting consumer anxiety about the cost of living. There's a real argument the current Canada standoff could follow the early stages of that same cycle. It's also worth contrasting Trump's current posture with what he was telling his own party just months earlier. At a National Republican Congressional Committee fundraising event earlier this year, Trump told House Republicans directly that tariffs would help them ahead of the midterms, describing the situation as good and predicting a landslide victory for his party. That confident prediction sits in stark contrast to his own Wednesday afternoon admission that the GOP doesn't fully grasp how badly things are going right now. Somewhere between those two statements, separated by months, the internal Republican assessment of how tariffs are actually playing with voters appears to have shifted from a confident talking point about economic nationalism to a publicly acknowledged concern about electoral risk. None of this means Trump reverses course on Canada specifically, and nothing here suggests Canada's own retaliation, set for September 8th, is unnecessary or purely symbolic. Carney's government has its own real domestic political costs to manage, acknowledged openly in Carney's own remarks about how Canada's retaliatory tariffs will raise costs and reduce choice for Canadian consumers, even while aiming to pressure Washington. But understanding the full picture, both sides facing genuine domestic political costs from continued escalation, both sides facing real economic pain from tariffs already in effect, and Washington specifically facing a legal challenge with meaningful odds of success stacked on top of its political troubles, paints a considerably more balanced picture of where actual leverage sits in this standoff than a simpler narrative of an all-powerful United States pressuring a dependent Canada into eventual submission. There's one more piece worth adding, because it addresses the most obvious counterargument to this entire analysis: the possibility that Trump simply doesn't care about any of this domestic pressure and intends to hold his position regardless of polling, party criticism, or legal risk. That possibility can't be dismissed entirely, given how consistently this administration has shown a willingness to absorb short-term political cost in pursuit of policy goals it considers strategically important. But even accounting for that, the practical mechanics of American governance mean this pressure can't simply be waved away by presidential will alone. Republican members of Congress worried about their own re-election prospects retain real leverage over legislative priorities the administration needs moving through Congress, regardless of trade policy specifics. Federal courts operate under legal principles that exist independently of executive branch political pressure, and a credentialed legal expert with a direct successful track record against this exact kind of tariff. Authority doesn't offer a high-confidence prediction like this lightly, and financial markets ultimately respond to underlying economic conditions regardless of how confidently any administration frames its own policy success, meaning continued consumer confidence declines, and approval drops carry real, independent weight whether or not the president himself chooses to acknowledge them. This context also matters because Trump's approval trajectory has been sliding for a considerable stretch of this year, driven by a combination of factors: ongoing economic anxiety, the extended Iran conflict, and rising cost of living frustration that predate this specific Canadian tariff collapse by a wide margin. The Canada standoff didn't create this vulnerability. It became the latest, most visible stress test landing on top of an administration that was already trending towards some of the weakest approval numbers of Trump's presidency well before these particular tariffs ever took effect. That context matters, because it means the pressure described here isn't a temporary blip tied to one bad news cycle, but the continuation of a pattern that's been building for months, making it considerably less likely to simply fade on its own without some meaningful shift in either policy or communication strategy from the administration heading into a midterm cycle that, by every metric covered here, currently looks genuinely difficult for Trump's party.